They didn't love you. They fed on you. Not your smile, not your soul. They wanted your surrender. The illusion of love was just the anesthetic. The real operation was hunger. Emotional predators don't seek connection. They seek consumption. And the cruelest part, you called it love while they quietly devoured your identity, your strength, your light. Schopenhauer was right. What you felt wasn't romance. It was biological bait. The will of life using your body, your heart, and your illusions as tools for a deeper instinct. Domination disguised as affection. You believed you were chosen. In truth, you were detected as prey. This is not a story about heartbreak. This is a dissection of psychological feeding. Welcome to the philosophy of devouring love. Love as biological illusion. The idea that love is sacred, transcendent, or even truly personal is one of the most persistent illusions in human history. Schopenhauer, in his radical pessimism, tore the romantic veil to reveal something brutal beneath. What we call love is merely nature's mechanism for ensuring reproduction. It is not divine, not noble, not even rational. It is a manipulation of consciousness designed to serve the blind will of life. For Schopenhauer, the individual is nothing but a pawn of the species. The emotional storms we suffer, the idealizations we fall into, the sacrifices we make in the name of love, none of it is for us. It's for a biological program that neither loves us back nor cares about our suffering. The heart races, the body burns, the mind obsesses, but not because you've found your soulmate. It happens because nature, in its cunning, has hijacked your perception and convinced you that this person is the one. When in truth, they're just a trigger, a vehicle for a genetic imperative that uses you and discards you. The consequences of this are devastating. If love is not truly yours, if it's a hallucination produced by your nervous system to enslave your actions, then what does that make the relationship? What does it make the other person? Worse still, what does it make you? You were never in control. You didn't choose to love. You were pushed chemically, hormonally, unconsciously. And once caught in that machinery, you became vulnerable to another kind of predator. Not just nature itself, but human beings who understand, consciously or not, how to exploit this illusion. The emotional carnivores. The ones who recognize the addictive pull of love and use it as bait. The ones who don't fall into the trap. They set the trap. And you? You mistook the feeling for freedom. You called it connection. You called it destiny. But what was really happening was biological puppetry. A cascade of neurotransmitters, dopamine, oxytocin, vasopressin, flooded your system, creating attachment, desire, obsession. But those chemicals didn't care about your well-being. They didn't care if the person you craved was lying, using you, draining you. Their only purpose was to ensure you bonded. And once you bonded, that you stayed. This is the cruelty of the biological illusion. It doesn't reward love with safety or clarity. It rewards persistence with more dependency. The more you give, the more you're tied. The more you're hurt, the more desperate you become for the original high. The love illusion is not just a trick to begin reproduction. It is the perfect emotional trap, a loop of craving and loss that makes you malleable, blind, and willing to endure anything to keep the fantasy alive. Schopenhauer's genius wasn't just that he saw through this, it was that he dared to name it. To say that love was not a gift, but a delusion, not a spiritual elevation, but a biological seduction. And in doing so, he exposed the terrifying vulnerability of the human animal. Our deepest feelings may be our most dangerous weaknesses. Because once someone understands that love is a biochemical illusion, they can use it, not to bond, but to control. They can become the emotional carnivore. They mirror your fantasy, ignite your longing, stimulate your addiction. But they never enter the illusion themselves. They remain lucid, detached, strategic. While you feel something real, they only calculate. While you offer your soul, they take inventory of how much more they can extract before your emotional system breaks. This is where the biological illusion becomes psychological warfare. You are no longer just a victim of nature. You are now a target for predators who weaponize the mechanisms of love. And the tragedy is that most never realize it. They spend years, even decades, believing they were loved when they were only used. Not for money, not for sex, but for emotional nourishment, for the attention, validation, and ego regulation that a broken, hungry person extracts from your devotion. The truth is brutal. You were programmed to feel deeply, but not designed to protect yourself emotionally. You are vulnerable by construction. And unless you awaken, unless you accept that love is not sacred but tactical, not personal but programmed, you will keep falling, again and again, into new illusions, with new faces, repeating old suffering. Schopenhauer's warning is not meant to destroy love, but to liberate you from being destroyed by it. Love, if it is to exist at all, must be filtered through lucidity. It must be examined, not surrendered to. Only then can it become something voluntary, something chosen, rather than imposed. But that's not what most people want. Most people want the illusion. They crave the ecstasy, the madness, the drama. And that's what makes them prey. Emotional carnivores don't love. They consume love. When viewed through the eyes of the emotionally naive, appears as mutual surrender. Two souls converging, merging, protecting each other. But that vision is a projection, not a reality. In truth, some individuals do not seek to love you. They seek to use your emotional system as a source of nourishment. They don't want connection. They want access. Not to your heart, but to your attention, to your vulnerability, to your energy. These are not people who fall in love. They fall into opportunity. They scan others like predators studying prey. They don't bond. They assess. They don't feel. They feed. And if you have ever been deeply empathetic, emotionally generous, or romantically idealistic, then you've likely been on their menu. The emotional carnivore is not always conscious of what they are. Some are fully aware, cold, calculating, manipulative. Others are simply addicted to emotional supply and have learned how to extract it. But the result is the same. They enter your life not to build something with you, but to devour what's already inside you. They reflect your needs, mirror your desires, and offer you the illusion of safety, just long enough to get what they want. And what do they want? It varies. For some, it's the feeling of being worshipped, admired, adored. For others, it's the power of having someone emotionally dependent. For others still, it's chaos itself, the thrill of seducing, breaking, and watching you bleed while they remain untouched. Whatever the goal, the method is consistent. Create intensity fast, bypass your defenses, then begin the slow, methodical extraction of your emotional resources. It begins innocently. Affection, attention, deep conversations at night. They seem to understand you, to see you in a way others haven't. You lower your guard. You open up. You start to attach. But what you don't see is that your attachment is being measured. Your emotional exposure is being analyzed for points of leverage. Because the emotional carnivore doesn't grow closer as you grow vulnerable, they gain control. And once they have control, love disappears and consumption begins. You may begin to feel it in small ways. Your emotions become unpredictable around them. You feel unsteady, anxious, off balance. You start to question yourself. They were so warm, so present. Now they're distant, cold, or confusing. You chase, you explain, you apologize, but that's the point. They've reversed the dynamic. Now you're the one trying to earn the connection you already gave freely. This reversal is their feeding ground. The moment you start to crave their validation is the moment they begin the real consumption. Every time you feel confused by their silence, every time you beg for clarity, every time you bend yourself into something smaller just to keep them interested, they feed. Not with cruelty, not always with malice, but with a hunger so deep and habitual that they no longer need to bite. They simply keep you starving while they hold the illusion of love above your head. They don't need to hurt you directly. Your emotional hunger does the work for them. You overthink, you perform, you try harder, and they remain still, detached, untouchable. And if you dare confront them, they retreat into victimhood, gaslight your memories, or punish you with withdrawal. This isn't love. This is psychological extraction, and it doesn't end with closure. It ends when there's nothing left to take. What makes them dangerous is not just the act of consumption, but the way they cloak it in affection. They use emotional language, romantic gestures, moments of passion, all the signals of love, to keep you confused. Because confusion is the most efficient way to keep you compliant. If you never know where you stand, you'll never stop trying to prove yourself. And the more you try, the more they consume. There's no mutuality here, no reciprocity, only transaction. But the price is never stated, and the debt is never clear. You pay in self-esteem, in energy, in silence, until one day you wake up and realize you've been emptied, and they've already moved on to the next source. The emotional carnivore does not devour you all at once. They savor you in stages. They make you question your instincts, betray your own needs, and shrink your sense of self. And they do it slowly enough that you blame yourself for the damage. That's the brilliance of the design. The consumption is masked as intimacy, and the destruction is internalized as personal failure. And so you stay. You rationalize, you hope, and they keep feeding. This is why it's not enough to love harder or communicate better. You are not in a relationship. You are in a power imbalance disguised as affection. And unless you break the illusion, unless you see the consumption for what it is, you will continue to give until you disappear. Schopenhauer saw love not as a bond between two people, but as a force that uses individuals to serve its own end, the survival of the species. But emotional carnivores take this one step further. They hijack that force for personal gain. They are not just products of nature. They are predators of emotion. And once you fall into their orbit, your logic, your boundaries, and your identity become currency. You were never loved. You were studied, targeted, seduced, and consumed. Not because you were weak, but because you were warm, open, sincere. That's what they crave. That's what they hunt. And unless you learn to shield it with clarity, with lucidity, with refusal, you will be devoured again. Pleasure is the bait. Pain is the cage. Every predator knows that pain alone doesn't capture prey. It is pleasure that opens the gate. In the emotional realm, this is especially true. Those who feed on others psychologically do not begin with cruelty. They begin with intensity, euphoria, seduction. They offer exactly what you've always longed to feel, not because they wish to give it, but because they know you'll return to it, even after it vanishes. This is the most effective trap. They introduce a high and then quietly take it away. The result is not rejection, it's addiction. The sudden intimacy, the passionate words, the attention that feels like salvation, all of it floods your system with emotional pleasure. You feel chosen, seen, needed. You believe you found something rare, someone who feels like home. But what you've actually found is the first layer of a cage. That pleasure was never love. It was bait. And once you're hooked, the nature of the game shifts. What was once consistent becomes erratic. What was once offered freely must now be earned. The compliments become rare, the touch colder, the presence more unpredictable. You begin to chase the version of them that only existed at the beginning, not realizing that version was a mask, carefully crafted to disarm you. And this is where pain enters. Not as violence, but as withdrawal. Not as punishment, but as absence. You don't know what you did wrong, only that the warmth is gone. And because the pleasure was so intense, your brain concludes the problem must be you. You try harder. You apologize more. You shrink, contort, abandon yourself, just to make them return to that original sweetness. But they don't return fully. They only offer glimpses, enough to keep the craving alive. This is not a failure of the relationship. This is the relationship. It has become a cycle. Reward, remove, confuse, repeat. And you are no longer a partner. You are a subject in an emotional experiment, trained through intermittent reinforcement, just like an addict chasing a vanished high. The brilliance of this tactic is that it leaves no clear scars. There is no yelling, no obvious betrayal, only the quiet, systematic conditioning of your nervous system. You don't even realize you're in pain. You just feel anxious, insecure, unworthy. You assume it's your fault, that you're too much or not enough or somehow broken. But you're not broken. You're trapped. Trapped in a dynamic where your suffering increases their control. Where the more disoriented you become, the more predictable your reactions are. They don't need to imprison you physically. The pain itself keeps you obedient. You no longer act from love. You act from fear of losing love. And once that fear dominates your behavior, they no longer need to seduce you. You seduce yourself back into the cage. This method is not accidental. It is instinctive to some, deliberate for others. But in both cases, the effect is the same. Emotional dependency. You begin to associate their presence with relief, their silence with threat, their affection with reward. They become the source of both your pain and your hope. And that duality is what keeps you bound. This isn't love. It's operant conditioning. And the cruelest part is that you defend them. You rationalize their neglect. You call their inconsistency complexity, their cruelty trauma, their distance mystery. But these words are only the vocabulary of your denial. You need them to be good. Because if they're not, then you were not loved. You were only baited and caged. And the pain of that truth feels unbearable, but it must be faced. Because until it is, you remain inside the loop, waiting, hoping, diminishing. Schopenhauer argued that what we experience as love is not under our control. It is the will of life using us, manipulating us for ends we don't understand. But when that manipulation is exploited by another human being, when someone uses pleasure and pain as instruments of power, the damage becomes personal, psychological, and often irreversible. You don't escape this dynamic by confronting them. You escape it by confronting yourself. You must ask why the brief moments of pleasure were enough to make you tolerate the slow erosion of your dignity. You must ask why you trusted the high more than the silence. And most of all, you must ask whether you were in love with them, or with the version of yourself you thought you could be, if only they loved you fully again. That version of yourself is still waiting, but not for them. For you. To stop mistaking pain for depth. To stop mistaking absence for mystery. To stop mistaking manipulation for fate. Pleasure lured you in. Pain kept you there, but the key has always been on the inside. Dependency disguised as connection. In the beginning, it feels like a miracle. You meet someone who understands you, or at least mirrors you so perfectly that you believe they do. They listen intently, respond with warmth, validate your wounds. They speak your language, anticipate your needs, fill your silences. You tell yourself, this is connection. But beneath the harmony, something more subtle is forming. A structure of dependency dressed as intimacy. The emotional carnivore does not build with you. They bind you to them. And they do it by making themselves indispensable, not in action, but in meaning. They become the source of your comfort, your clarity, your sense of worth. They don't encourage your autonomy. They encourage your attachment. And the deeper that attachment grows, the more you confuse it with love. But love and dependency are not the same. Love offers. Dependency demands. Love liberates. Dependency shrinks. And the line between the two becomes dangerously blurred when your emotional identity is constructed through someone else's approval. When their attention defines your value, and their withdrawal threatens your stability, you are no longer in a relationship. You are in a psychological contract of submission. It often begins with empathy. The emotional carnivore presents vulnerability first. They share their pain, their past, their fears. You feel special for being trusted. You feel chosen. You open yourself in return. But what you don't realize is that this exchange is not mutual. It is directional. Your disclosures are stored as ammunition. Your empathy becomes a lever. Slowly, your life begins to orbit around their moods, their needs, their presence. You start checking your phone constantly, timing your messages, adjusting your words. Not because you want to, but because you've been trained to associate emotional security with their validation. This is not connection. This is dependency installed through psychological conditioning. You stop expressing dissatisfaction. You fear their reaction. You censor yourself to maintain the illusion of peace. And when you do assert a need or a boundary, they respond with confusion, guilt, silence, or even subtle punishment. Their affection becomes conditional. And the condition is always the same. Stay soft, stay available, stay quiet. This is how dependency is disguised, as sensitivity, as care, as closeness. But it is none of those things. It is erosion. You begin to lose the ability to distinguish your own emotions from theirs. You anticipate their needs before they speak. You tolerate behavior that once would have repelled you. You become smaller, more pliable, more anxious. But you call it being in love. This distortion is powerful because it flatters your deepest longing to be seen, to be accepted, to belong. But what you belong to is not love. It is a system that feeds on your compliance. And the more you comply, the more disconnected from yourself you become. Schopenhauer described the individual as an illusion, a fleeting phenomenon driven by a will that cares nothing for personal happiness. In that view, relationships are not havens. They are tools of nature's machinery, devices to ensure continuity, not fulfillment. The emotional carnivore takes this further. They use the illusion of connection as a tool to fracture the self. They replace your inner compass with their shifting presence. And you, desperate for connection, surrender your independence in exchange for scraps of warmth. They do not want an equal. They want an extension. Someone whose emotional landscape they can control. Someone who no longer trusts their own perceptions, only the approval or disapproval of the one they crave. And once you reach this stage, leaving doesn't feel like an option. It feels like suicide, because they've become your oxygen, and breathing without them feels impossible. But it's not impossible. It's just unfamiliar. You've spent so long seeking their validation that you've forgotten how to validate yourself. You've allowed your sense of self to be outsourced, not because you were weak, but because you were conditioned. Slowly, skillfully, under the disguise of affection. The pain you feel is not from losing love. It is from losing the illusion that the dependency was love. And once that illusion breaks, what remains is not emptiness, but the beginning of your return to real connection, to self-respect, to emotional clarity, because connection cannot exist where one is consumed by the other, and love cannot flourish in a cage of need. The soul is devoured in silence. Destruction doesn't always arrive with noise. It doesn't always scream or shatter or bleed. Sometimes, the most devastating erosion happens quietly, without warning, without confrontation, without a single raised voice. It happens in the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the calculated, punishing silence that empties you of certainty, identity, and trust. Emotional carnivores understand this well. They do not always strike with overt violence. Their method is subtler, more efficient, more permanent. They use absence as a weapon. They withhold as a means of control, not by disappearing entirely, but by withdrawing just enough to keep you guessing, doubting, needing. You never know where you stand. And that ambiguity is the breeding ground of despair. At first, the silence confuses you. You replay conversations, scan your own behavior, try to decode the shift. Everything felt fine. Then suddenly, they're cold, or distant, or gone. And the punishment is never spoken, never named. That's what makes it effective. There's nothing to argue against, no clear event to address. Just a void that you're expected to fill with guilt. And you do. You apologize without knowing why. You over-explain. You beg for clarity. But none comes, because clarity would end the control. And the point of this silence is not resolution, it's dominance. It's a form of emotional starvation that keeps you weak, submissive, and desperate to restore harmony. They don't need to raise their voice. They just need to disappear a little and let your mind do the rest. This is where the devouring begins. Not of your body or even your emotions, but of your soul, your internal coherence, your ability to feel whole in your own skin. You start to second-guess your instincts. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too needy, too intense. You suppress your voice to avoid triggering another withdrawal. And slowly, piece by piece, you stop existing for yourself. You become a reflection of their moods, a response to their silences, a caretaker of their comfort. You laugh at what they like, avoid what they reject, contort yourself to fit the shape of their preferences. Not because they ask, but because they've taught you that your value is conditional. And when that value is threatened by their silence, you'll betray yourself just to restore it. This is how the soul is devoured, not by external force, but by internal decay. You abandon your boundaries, your needs, your voice, not all at once, but slowly, in 1,000 small silences, each one a compromise, each one a quiet erasure, until one day you realize the person you were at the beginning no longer exists. You've become a shell molded by their absences. And if you try to speak up to reclaim some part of yourself, you're met with denial. You're imagining things. You're overreacting. I've done nothing wrong. And in a technical sense, that may be true. They didn't yell. They didn't hit. They didn't leave. They just disappeared inside the space where intimacy once lived and let you rot in confusion. This tactic is particularly cruel because it leaves no clear evidence. You can't explain it to friends. You can't show screenshots. You sound unreasonable, emotional, even paranoid. That's by design. The silence is invisible, but its impact is seismic. It disorients you so profoundly that you begin to sabotage yourself. You become anxious, clingy, reactive, and then they call you the problem. This reversal is the final twist of the knife. You, the one being emotionally tortured, now appear as the unstable one, and they remain calm, detached, composed, even proud of their ability to stay above the drama. They devour you in silence and then judge you for bleeding. Schopenhauer believed that the self is an illusion, a fleeting mask worn by the will. And in these dynamics, that illusion is not only fleeting, but targeted. The emotional predator doesn't just ignore your soul, they erase it. They replace your internal world with their silence, and then claim innocence while you implode. This is not love. This is annihilation by omission, a disappearance that leaves no fingerprints, but steals everything. And the longer you stay, the less you'll remember what wholeness felt like. Recovery doesn't begin with confrontation. It begins with recognition. You must see the silence for what it is. Not peace, but punishment. Not space, but strategy. Not restraint, but control. And once you name it, you must resist the urge to explain yourself, to earn affection, to chase resolution. Because the more you chase, the deeper you sink into the void they created. Your soul cannot be recovered by the one who erased it. You must reclaim it in your own voice, not to prove anything to them, but to remind yourself that you still exist. Silence is their weapon, but your voice is your return. Lucidity as liberation. Clarity is not gentle. It rarely arrives as a soft realization or a peaceful awakening. True lucidity feels like betrayal, like the sudden collapse of a reality you trusted. It doesn't free you immediately. It breaks you first. But in that fracture lies your first real chance to escape. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. And what you begin to see when lucidity pierces the illusion is that what you called love was, in fact, your submission. You begin to realize that your suffering wasn't caused by misunderstanding, but by design. That the confusion wasn't incidental, but instrumental. That you were not part of a relationship, but part of a system. One where your worth was tied to how much you could tolerate, how much you could offer, how quietly you could bleed. It is in this moment of recognition, when the mask slips, when the pattern becomes undeniable, that a violent clarity surges through you. Not rage, not even sadness. Something colder, something still. A silence inside you that is no longer submission, but detachment. And in that detachment, lucidity blooms. Lucidity does not romanticize. It does not hope. It does not beg. It watches. It remembers. It counts the patterns, tracks the silences, measures the inconsistencies. And when it finally speaks, it does not scream. It whispers the most dangerous sentence you can carry. This was never love. This whisper is the key. Because everything that held you in place, the guilt, the longing, the confusion, depended on the belief that love was real, that it could still return, that you just needed to try harder. But once lucidity dismantles that belief, the cage unlocks from the inside. Not because they let you go, but because you stop asking to stay. Schopenhauer's worldview is often dismissed as too bleak, too cruel. But his genius lies precisely in that cruelty. He offers not hope, but release through recognition. He tells you, the suffering is not accidental. The illusion was not yours alone. Life uses you. Desire uses you. And others will use you if you do not see them clearly. But in that truth, there is a kind of salvation, Not the kind that restores innocence, but the kind that gives you armor. Once you understand the machinery, you stop being machinery. Once you see the pattern, you stop participating blindly. Once you feel the betrayal not as a personal wound, but as a universal mechanism, you begin to detach. Lucidity teaches you the difference between warmth and manipulation, between presence and performance, between love and leverage. It sharpens your perception until you can read between the words, sense the pauses, decode the timing. And in this sharpening, you become unappetizing to predators, not because you're bitter, but because you're no longer willing to feed them. You stop responding to bait. You stop defending yourself against passive aggression. You stop handing over your peace in exchange for attention, because you no longer need their validation to feel real. You no longer mistake chaos for passion. You no longer confuse emotional starvation with depth. Lucidity does not make you invulnerable, but it makes you sovereign. And that sovereignty is what emotional carnivores cannot digest. They need your blindness. They need your belief in the fantasy. They need you hungry enough to accept crumbs and confused enough to stay. Once you're lucid, you refuse. Not loudly, not violently. You just stop engaging. You stop chasing. You stop explaining your worth to people who benefit from your doubt. And in doing so, you rob them of the power they built in silence. Lucidity is not the end of love. It is the end of illusion. And from there, something cleaner can begin. A different love. Not soft, not naive, not self-erasing, but deliberate, discerning, mutual. But you must pass through fire to reach it, through grief, through rage, through the mourning of what you thought you had. And when you emerge, you will not be the same. You will be harder to impress, quieter in your expectations, sharper in your boundaries. But you will also be free, and freedom, once tasted, cannot be untasted. Schopenhauer didn't offer comfort. He offered lucidity, as a blade, as a mirror, as a way out. He knew that liberation does not begin with love. It begins when you no longer need to be loved to feel whole. So walk out, not with vengeance, with clarity. You were devoured, yes, but you are not destroyed. You are awake. And in a world that feeds on the unconscious, lucidity is the most radical form of self-defense.